Thank you for joining us for Margin Notes. As you can see on the screens, this is the final video on the book of Numbers. We'll be covering Numbers chapters 28 through 36. These videos are produced by the Central Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky, and we are glad to be able to do these for you. If you are just jumping on margin notes the first time, have no idea what's going on, these videos are meant to just share with you some of the notes that I have in the margin of my Bible. As I say most of the time in these videos, some of these are notes I've had for a while. But in preparation for these videos, I am restudying these books and gaining new notes and hopefully new knowledge beyond the notes as I do so. And so some of these are new to me as well as far as the notes themselves and things that I encourage you to study and evaluate on your own. And if you mark in your Bible, maybe some of these will be helpful to you. I always encourage you to write these down first in a notebook or notepad, or keep them somewhere on your computer. Evaluate them for yourself. Is it something you want to include in the margin of your Bible or wherever you keep your Bible study notes? Maybe you don't, and that's fine. The text of the Bible itself is inspired. My notes certainly aren't, and so I understand if these are things that you don't find all that helpful, or maybe you want to reword them. That's totally fine. Since this is the last video on the book of Numbers, when we get through with this video, at the end of it, we will let you know where we're going next. But if you're new to Margin Notes, we've already done full series on the books of Genesis and Exodus, and then jumped over to the New Testament for a video and did a very short video on the very brief book of Philemon, and then came back to the Old Testament and did Leviticus, and now we are finishing up Numbers, and we'll let you know our plan going forward at the end of this video. So even though there are several chapters here, we don't have a ton of notes for you, and part of the reason for that is because a lot of this latter portion of the book of Numbers, these last, 8 or 9 chapters, deal with a lot of laws going forward in the wilderness and as they prepare to enter the promised land and those sorts of things. Of course, we could make dozens and dozens and dozens of notes out of these laws, but just a few I want to share with you as we go through these. And again, these are not meant to be this is not meant to be a Bible study. These are just meant to be notes, and so we don't go into deep explanation of each one, but hopefully each one of these encourages your own Bible study. So the first is found in Numbers chapter 28 and verse 11. The full verse says, "At the beginning of your months, you shall offer a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls from the herd, 1 ram, 7 male lambs a year without blemish." And then it goes on to talk about other things that are supposed to be involved in these monthly offerings. But the phrase "at the beginning of your months" is where I have a note here. And the note is this, that they used, for lack of a better term, a lunar calendar. And so then later in the Old Testament, these same things are referred to as new moon sacrifices. And I have a couple of references there that you may want to include in the margin of your Bible as well. 1 Samuel 20, 2 Kings chapter 4, where you have this reference that seems to kind of come out of nowhere in the Old Testament of new moon sacrifices. Oh, they worshiping the moon or something? No, this is the same thing found here in Numbers 28, the beginning of your months, because they followed what we might term the lunar calendar. They dealt with months in that way through new moon to new moon, and so the beginning of the month was a new moon. And so then you have later in the Old Testament that terminology used. It's not something new. It's just a way of referring to the same thing in a slightly different way. And so just a connection there to later in the Old Testament that might help your study, especially as you come to those passages. And by the way, you might want to mark back in those passages, 1 Samuel 20, 2 Kings 4, to this passage in Numbers 28 to remind yourself of that's what this is talking about, this new moon sacrifice or new moon festival or whatever it's called there in those passages. The second note is found from Numbers 29. I almost said it's also in Numbers 28, but Numbers 29 is not Numbers 28, is it? Numbers 29, verse 1. "On the first day of the 7th month, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a day for you to blow your trumpets." This is one of the places where I need to remind you, and I think I messed up and put it under my computer. I did. This is going to be shaky for a second. My computer stand is a stack of books, by the way, of a very fancy system here from Margin Notes. But I need to remind you that the Bibles that I use for marking are the English Standard Version Journal Bibles. So I have the text on one side and blank pages on the other side. And so some of the notes that I have are very lengthy, paragraphs every so often. This is one where what I'm sharing with you is just part of a note. Okay, the note that I'm sharing with you, the part of it is that the seventh month was a special month, holding more sacred feasts, and that should be plural feasts, feast days, than any other. Now, the other part of the note that I'm not sharing with you just because I know most people don't have that much room to write in is a reminder of that the seventh day was a Sabbath day. And then seventh years were special years. And so by specifically mentioning the seventh month, then you have a continuation there of the fact that even that seventh month was something that was very special. Now, the whole month, in other words, all 28 days of the month, the whole lunar month was not set apart as feast days, but the seventh month in total contained more sacred feasts or feast days than any other month. And so again, you may want to add to this note with a thing about the seventh day Sabbath or the seventh year or the seventh year being special. But as far as just if you don't have a whole lot of room, this is enough of a note just to remind yourself of that number 7, and that this month was very, very special in their calendar throughout the year. Numbers chapter 30. You have two phrases in that verse that are very, very similar. The verse in total reads this way: If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word, he shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Now, the way you and I read that, those seem like basically saying the same thing twice. Vows a vow, swears an oath. They are similar, but there's a reason why both of these are listed. It's not just for emphasis, although it is partially for emphasis, but it's not just for that. So the note that I have is that the word vow was a word to do something, while the word for an oath was most often used as a word to abstain from something. So when you vowed a vow, you were saying, I will do this. When you swore an oath, you were saying, I will abstain from this. That could be something like fasting. It could be something like abstaining from sexual relations. The New Testament talks about that in 1 Corinthians 7. And so, again, these are two sides of the same coin. They are very, very similar concepts. But that's why you have two phrases there, is that one is I will do, and the other is I will avoid, or I will abstain from something. And that may just be of interest to you as you read those verses where you talk, well, why are they saying the same thing? Well, they're not really. They're saying similar things, but not the same thing. Numbers chapter 31 and verse 6. The reason this one has dots in the middle is because it's a really long phrase in the verse that I have underlined, or actually have it squared, rectangled, I guess more technically, in my Bible. You have a section here in number 31 where the Lord's people are going to take vengeance on the people of Midian. It's a long reading, but in verse 6 you have this: And Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 from each tribe. Here's the long phrase: together with Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest, with the vessels of the sanctuary, with the trumpets for the alarm of his hand. And then verse 7 talks about how they went to war against the people of Midian. So that really long phrase, together with Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest. I have in the margin of my Bible that phrase is there, at least in part, to show that this was a holy battle, or you might want to say a God-directed battle. Priests were not always directly involved in the battle. Specifically, priests did not always go into the battlefield. They might have done some things in the camp or preparation or those sorts of things, but as far as actually going into the battle or onto the battlefield, that was not a common thing. And so by having Phinehas the priest, Phinehas the son of Eleazar the priest, go with the troops into the battlefield, it was showing that this was a holy battle or a God-directed battle. You may want to choose a different word, that's fine. But that's one of the reasons why that phrase is there. And it'll be something that plays a role when the people come into the promised land, of the priests doing various things as far as the warfare, again, in preparation or other things. But this is a precursor to that, found before the people go into the promised land as they're fighting this battle in the wilderness itself. Numbers chapter 31, again, verse 27, you have the note here because it's really something beside the whole verse. In other words, it's an explanation or an application of the verse. Let's read verses 25 through 27. The Lord said to Moses, which by the way is a great memory verse, the Lord said to Moses, take the count of the plunder that was taken, both of man and of beast, you and Eleazar the priest, and the heads of the fathers' houses of the congregation. Here's the key verse. And divide the plunder into two parts, between the warriors who went out to battle and all the congregation. The note that I have beside that, especially verse 27, is that they were supposed to both get part of the plunder because both were faithful in their part, even if they weren't in the battlefield. And I have a cross reference here to 1 Samuel chapter 30 that talks about the same principle in verses 24 and 25 of that chapter. The people who went out into the battle received some of the plunder because they were faithful in fighting the battle. The people who did not go into the battle received some of the plunder because even though they stayed in the camp, they were doing what God said to do in the camp. They were faithful in that and supporting the troops and those sort of things. It's a great passage, by the way, to do a devotional thought on, even a short sermon on, about everyone doing their part and being rewarded and those sorts, being rewarded by God and those sorts of things. But this is one of those places where you have that principle of not everyone has to be on the front lines, but everyone has to be involved. And so that's just a note of application or a note of explanation there that might be encouraging to you as you come to this section of Numbers in chapter 31. Numbers chapter 32 and verse 17, a very short phrase that I have marked as the phrase ready to go. Numbers 32, beginning of verse 16, this is when the tribes that are going to be settling east of the Jordan, I forgot my directions there, east of the Jordan and not settling west of the Jordan, not settling quote-unquote in the promised land. This is when they're talking about making sure that they are going to help the people in the battles in the promised land, but they're ready to start settling their families. Verse 16 says, then they came near to him and said, we will build sheepfolds here for our livestock and cities for our little ones, which, by the way, you could have a note there by little ones. It doesn't just mean your children. Little ones literally is descendants, so just simply those that are under their care. Verse 17, but we will take up arms ready to go before the people of Israel, until we have brought them to their place, and our little ones' descendants shall live in the fortified cities because the inhabitants of the land. That little phrase, ready to go. Now, this is going to be an obvious note, but it's one that just helps me when I come to this passage. The Hebrew word literally means hurrying. We will be hurrying before the people of Israel. And so it possibly indicates their willingness to bear the brunt of the battles. You're letting us settle our people on this side of the Jordan River, and we're going to go ahead and build sheepfolds and those sorts of things so our little ones, our descendants, can be safe. But because you're letting us do that, we will hurry ahead of the people of Israel. We will fight harder than they do, if you please, or at least in front of them, as these battles rage on for who knows how long. But just the willingness of them to say, hey, we know you're making concession here, but here's what we're going to do is a powerful, powerful thought in Numbers chapter 32. Near the end of Numbers chapter 32, you have some people who are listed in verse 38. Sorry, I turned the page. I shouldn't. I was in the wrong chapter. That's not what I was talking about. Not people listed, places listed. I knew something didn't seem right. This is going to be fun to read. Beginning in verse 37, you have a lot of places named. And the people of Reuben built Heshbon, Elealeh, Kiriathaim, Nebo, and Baal-meon. And then you have this little parenthetical phrase, their names were changed. And then it has they built Sibmah, and they gave other names to cities they built. That little phrase, their names were changed. Why? Well, part of the hint is the one that's listed right before that phrase, Baal-meon or Baal-meon. Their names were changed because they were named for pagan deities. Now, we're not told what they were changed to. In other words, it doesn't say Baal-meon became, Paducah or whatever. But they changed the names because these were places that were named after false gods or false deities, or at least false beliefs. And so they would change the names because of that. That's one reason, I think, why that phrase falls right after the one that's the most obvious, Baal-meon. Baal, or Baal, being that false god that's so infamous in the Old Testament. But that's why these names are changed in these places. Numbers chapter 33, or really before Numbers chapter 33, you have a travelogue. In fact, in the English Standard Version, before chapter 33 and verse 1, the chapter is given the title Recounting Israel's Journey. But that really doesn't start until verse 5, where you start to have all these places listed. Here's where the people went, and then they went here, and then they went here, and it goes on and on and on. But the note that I have before that verse is this. In this entire list, or this entire travelogue, there is no mention of Israel's sins in the wilderness. You can try to surmise why that's the case. It seems most logical to me that that would be the case because this is meant to be encouraging to the people who are now getting ready into the promised land. Instead of reminding them of the sins that the previous generation had done, let's be forward looking. It could simply be to focus the people on God and the fact that He led them through all these places. So there's any number of points of application that we could make or make a guess at, but the simple fact is that it's just to be noted that there's no mention of Israel's sins. They'll be noted later. Deuteronomy mentioned them several times, but here they're just not named or listed, and that's just of interest in that particular list. Numbers chapter 34, verses 4 and 8. I made a mistake here of having the passage and the note on there. You have a couple of places listed where the boundaries of the promised land are given. Verse 4, your border shall turn south of the ascent of Akrabim and cross the Zin, and its limit shall be south of Kadesh Barnea. That's the place to note in verse 4, Kadesh Barnea. Down to verse 7 and 8. This shall be your northern border. From the great sea you shall draw a line to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor you shall draw a line to Lebo Hamath. That's the place. And the limit of the border shall be at Zedad. Between those two verses, or between those two words, Kadesh Barnea in verse 4 and Lebo Hamath in verse 8, that's where the spies had gone in. And then became the boundary, and that should say southernmost and northernmost boundary, of where they had done their work. And so the spies had spied out the entire land. And again, that should say southernmost and northernmost boundary. And now that's the land they're going to receive. So you have a tie back there to the spies who had gone to the land that did their work. And now the people are going to be receiving that land. This is the border of it. From that place to the south, Kadesh Barnea, where the spies went in, and then Lebo Hamath, which became the northern boundary of where the spies had been, now become the northern boundary of the promised land. Numbers 35, verses 31 and 32, as we get in my Bible, the one I'm reading from, the last page of Numbers. Let's read 30, 31, and 32. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for a life of a murderer, who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. And so the note that I have here is only the death of someone can atone for a murder or a manslaughter. Manslaughter being the reference to the cities of refuge. That's why they were there, was to make sure that it was actually a murder or actually a manslaughter, not just an accidental death. And so you have a reference there to the need for not just revenge, but a need for atonement by the blood of the person who committed the murder. So we hope these have encouraged you. We've gone through the book of Numbers, none from chapter 36. I've got a couple in my Bible, but none I wanted to share. We hope all these have encouraged you through this fairly long book, but Numbers, while it kind of jumps around a little bit in some things, it's a fairly straightforward book. A lot of our notes you've noticed in this book have come from maybe oddities of sacrifice or geography and that sort of thing. But as far as a book to understand, it's a fairly straightforward book, and so I hope these notes have just added to your depth of knowledge, maybe more than the breadth of knowledge, as we've gone through the book. You may already be able to guess where we're going next. We've done Genesis and Exodus and jumped to the New Testament. Now we come back to Leviticus and Numbers. We are going to go ahead and move to the book of Deuteronomy. And one difference we will do here is usually we do videos every 2 weeks. We're going to take a 2-week break this time. In other words, it's going to be a month before our next video. And that's simply because we're starting to get a little bit caught up in recording and things. So we're kind of buying ourselves some time. But also because once we have finished Deuteronomy, we're going to be moving back to the New Testament and personally, frankly. The books we're going to do following that are shorter, but I want to really do a deep dive study into them. The plan is after Deuteronomy to do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, so only total 7 chapters. But I really want to do some deep dive study preparing for those, so that kind of buys me a little bit of time as well. As I've said, I I share notes that I have, but I also restudy these books to a certain degree for these videos, and I want to make sure that we don't take a huge break between Deuteronomy and then jumping to the New Testament. But that is the plan: is to finish up the books of the law or the books of Moses, beginning with the next video 1 month from now. That'll be late April, uh, with the book of Deuteronomy. And then that should take us through, I believe, April, May, and June, if I remember correctly. And then we will do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Once we have finished those videos, Lord willing, we will have done 9 books of the Bible, which is remarkable that we're still going with this. But we hope these all encourage you. If you're interested in these things, make sure you subscribe to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. We release them on both. Subscribe to both. That'd be helpful to us as well, and tell other people about this. But above all things, we hope that all these videos encourage you to read the Bible, study the Bible, and live the Bible. Thanks for watching.